A mansion filled with silence. A man haunted by his choices. And 4 children who hold the answers to questions Ethan Caldwell didn't even know he had. Sometimes, life gives you a second chance, but only if you're brave enough to take it. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey. Ethan Caldwell had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and influence. As the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, a global conglomerate, his name was synonymous with success. His penthouse towered over the city skyline, a symbol of his achievements. Expensive suits, luxury cars, and exclusive events were his everyday reality. Yet, despite it all, Ethan often found himself staring out the glass windows of his top-floor office, a drink in hand, wondering why the emptiness inside him grew louder with every passing day. At 42, Ethan was undeniably successful in business but profoundly bankrupt in emotional connections. His days were consumed by boardroom meetings, profit charts, and cold negotiations. At night, he returned to a cavernous mansion that echoed with silence. The walls, adorned with priceless artwork, seemed to mock him with their stillness. No family photos graced the mantelpiece. No laughter ever filled the air. For all his accomplishments, Ethan realized that his life lacked the one thing money couldn't buy: genuine connection. It wasn't always like this. In his early 30s, driven by ambition and a desire to build an empire, Ethan had made sacrifices. Friendships faded. Romantic relationships crumbled under the weight of his relentless schedule. And any thought of starting a family had been shelved indefinitely. Later, he'd tell himself, there will always be time later. But now, as the years stretched behind him, Ethan began to feel the weight of those lost moments. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of negotiations with overseas investors, Ethan found himself in his study, nursing a glass of bourbon. The distant hum of the city filled the silence around him. A single photo sat on his desk: his late mother, a gentle woman who had always told him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollar signs but in love shared with others. Her words echoed in his mind, and for a brief moment, the stoic mask he wore every day cracked. The next morning, Ethan's routine resumed as always. Chauffeur-driven car, back-to-back meetings, and brief glances at his phone filled with unread messages. Yet, a nagging thought persisted in the back of his mind, a question he couldn't quite articulate, an itch he couldn't scratch. During his lunch break at an upscale downtown cafe, he spotted something, or rather, someone that made him freeze in his tracks. Across the patio, a woman sat with 4 children. The kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, were laughing and chatting animatedly as they shared a pizza. But it wasn't their playful energy that stopped Ethan mid-step, it was their faces. Their features, expressions, and even the way one of the boys pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose struck an eerie familiarity in Ethan's mind. He felt as if he were looking into a mirror of his younger self. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-30s, had an air of quiet resilience about her. Her brown hair was loosely tied back, and though her clothes were simple, there was an undeniable warmth in her smile as she interacted with the children. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off them. Who were they? And why did they look so familiar? As if sensing his gaze, the woman briefly glanced in Ethan's direction. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a strange recognition. Perhaps. Ethan quickly turned away, his heart beating faster than it had in years. For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the woman and her children from his mind. During a board meeting that afternoon, he found himself distracted, staring blankly at financial projections while his thoughts drifted back to that cafe patio. That night, as he lay in bed in his vast, empty bedroom, Ethan couldn't escape the nagging question that had taken root in his mind. Who were they? And why did those children look so much like him? Unbeknownst to him, that moment at the cafe was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt something stir deep within him, a spark of curiosity. A glimmer of something he had almost forgotten, hope. The next morning, Ethan's routine resumed as always. Chauffeur-driven car, back-to-back meetings, and brief glances at his phone filled with unread messages. Yet, a nagging thought persisted in the back of his mind, a question he couldn't quite articulate, an itch he couldn't scratch. During his lunch break at an upscale downtown cafe, he spotted something, or rather, someone that made him freeze in his tracks. Across the patio, a woman sat with 4 children. The kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, were laughing and chatting animatedly as they shared a pizza. But it wasn't their playful energy that stopped Ethan mid-step, it was their faces, their features, expressions, and even the way one of the boys pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose struck an eerie familiarity in Ethan's mind. He felt as if he were looking into a mirror of his younger self. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-30s, had an air of quiet resilience about her. Her brown hair was loosely tied back, and though her clothes were simple, there was an undeniable warmth in her smile as she interacted with the children. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off them. Who were they? And why did they look so familiar? As if sensing his gaze, the woman briefly glanced in Ethan's direction. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a strange recognition. Perhaps. Ethan quickly turned away, his heart beating faster than it had in years. For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the woman and her children from his mind. During a board meeting that afternoon, he found himself distracted, staring blankly at financial projections while his thoughts drifted back to that cafe patio. That night, as he lay in bed in his vast, empty bedroom, Ethan couldn't escape the nagging question that had taken root in his mind. Who were they? And why did those children look so much like him? Unbeknownst to him, that moment at the cafe was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt something stir deep within him, a spark of curiosity. A glimmer of something he had almost forgotten, hope. The grand dining room of Ethan Caldwell's mansion was bathed in the warm glow of an ornate chandelier. The long mahogany table, usually reserved for lavish dinner parties with high-profile guests, now hosted an entirely different scene. Plates of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables were scattered across the table, and the sound of children laughing filled the cavernous space. Emily Carter sat at one end, her children surrounding her, while Ethan occupied the seat at the head of the table. The children were visibly more relaxed now, their initial nervousness fading with every passing moment. The youngest boy, Oliver, grinned widely as he attempted to balance a carrot stick on his nose, prompting laughter from his siblings. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he watched them. It was such a simple, unfiltered joy, something he couldn't remember ever experiencing in his own childhood. His gaze drifted to Emily, who met his eyes with a soft smile. It was a look filled with gratitude but also a hint of cautious hope. After dinner, Ethan suggested they move to the sitting room. The children made themselves at home on the plush carpet, playing with a set of vintage wooden toys that had been gathering dust in one of the mansion's many closets. Ethan and Emily sat across from each other on leather armchairs, a faint tension hanging in the air as they both tried to find the right words. "Thank you for dinner," Emily began, her voice soft but sincere. "The kids had a wonderful time. It's been a while since we've had such a warm evening together." Ethan nodded, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. "Emily, I have so many questions. About them. About you. About how all of this happened." Emily took a deep breath, her eyes briefly flicking to her children before returning to Ethan. "After my marriage ended, I was left with nothing but a small settlement and a broken heart. My ex-husband and I tried for years to have children, but it never happened. When the divorce papers were signed, I realized I had to stop waiting for life to hand me what I wanted. I had to take control." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I used the settlement money to come here to the United States and started looking into fertility clinics. That's when I found Glenfield. They were professional, discreet, and offered a chance at motherhood that I never thought I'd have." Ethan listened intently, his jaw tightening slightly at the mention of Glenfield. He remembered those days vividly, the overwhelming stress of trying to save his failing startup, the crushing debt, and the impulsive decision to donate sperm. At the time, it had seemed like an easy way to get quick cash. He never imagined it would lead to this. "I never thought about the people on the other side of those donations," Ethan said quietly. "To me, it was transactional, a means to an end. But now, seeing them, knowing they're a part of me, it's overwhelming." Emily's expression softened. "I understand. And I never planned on finding you. I didn't come looking for you. But when I saw you at that cafe and the way you looked at them, I realized I couldn't keep this a secret from you. They deserve to know. And maybe you deserve to know them, too." The weight of her words hung in the air. Ethan's gaze shifted to the children, who were now building an elaborate tower out of wooden blocks. His throat tightened as he considered the enormity of what Emily had given him, a chance to know them, to be part of their lives. "What are their names?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking slightly. Emily smiled faintly. "The oldest is Amelia. She's sharp, kind, and fiercely protective of her siblings. Then there's Jacob, he's thoughtful and loves to read. Oliver, the little one with the carrot trick, is our resident comedian. And finally, Lily, she's the dreamer, always lost in her imagination." Ethan repeated their names softly, committing them to memory. Each name felt like a key, unlocking a door he hadn't known existed. As the evening wore on, Emily began to relax, sharing stories about the children, their quirks, their hobbies, their little victories. Ethan listened intently, hanging on every word. He learned that Amelia loved art and could spend hours sketching in her notebook, that Jacob was fascinated by astronomy, that Oliver had an uncanny ability to make everyone laugh, and that Lily dreamed of becoming a ballerina. In return, Ethan shared glimpses of his own life, his childhood, his mother's wisdom, and the pressures of running a business empire. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to open up, to let someone see past the polished exterior he had so carefully constructed. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, signaling that the evening had stretched far longer than any of them had realized. The children were beginning to yawn, their playful energy finally winding down. "We should go," Emily said, rising from her seat. "It's getting late, and they need their rest." Ethan stood as well, his hesitation clear. "Emily, thank you for tonight, for trusting me enough to bring them here." She smiled, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Thank you for welcoming us, Ethan. I know this isn't easy for you, but I think this is a start." As they made their way to the front door, Amelia paused and turned back to Ethan. "Will we see you again, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan crouched down to her level, his voice steady but warm. "You can call me Ethan. And yes, I'd like that very much." The door closed behind them, leaving Ethan standing alone in the grand foyer. But for the first time in years, the silence of the mansion didn't feel so crushing. It felt hopeful. Somewhere deep inside him, a seed had been planted, one that would grow into something far greater than he could yet comprehend. Sunlight spilled across the expansive lawn of Ethan Caldwell's estate, illuminating the perfectly manicured gardens and the sparkling surface of the backyard pool. The air was filled with the sound of laughter as 4 children raced across the grass, their shoes abandoned in a carefree pile near the patio. Ethan stood on the veranda, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks, watching the scene unfold before him. Amelia was chasing Jacob with a squirt gun, her long brown hair flying behind her. Oliver was attempting to catch a butterfly with Lily cheering him on. Emily Carter sat at a small table nearby, sipping lemonade and observing her children with a soft smile. "You know," Ethan said as he approached Emily, his voice carrying a hint of warmth rarely heard, "I can't remember the last time this place felt so alive." Emily looked up at him and smiled. "It's amazing what a little laughter can do." Ethan nodded and turned his gaze back to the children. For years, his mansion had been a hollow, echoing space, a symbol of his success but also of his loneliness. But today, it was filled with light, energy, and joy. "Are you sure I'm not intruding on your day?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Not at all," Ethan replied quickly. "If anything, you've given me something I didn't realize I was missing." After lunch, a delightful outdoor meal complete with grilled sandwiches, fresh fruit, and homemade lemonade, Ethan suggested an outing. The children's faces lit up with excitement as he announced they'd be going shopping, followed by a stop at an ice cream parlor and then the park. The ride into the city was filled with chatter and occasional bursts of laughter. Ethan drove himself, leaving his chauffeur behind, relishing the rare chance to experience something so ordinary yet so precious. Amelia peppered him with questions about his car, while Oliver entertained everyone with his over-the-top impressions of cartoon characters. At the shopping mall, Ethan found himself in unfamiliar territory. While he was no stranger to luxury stores, he had never ventured into the children's section. But today, he followed eagerly as Emily helped the children pick out clothes and shoes. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked as Lily clutched a bright pink dress with glittering stars on it. "Absolutely," Ethan said with a smile. "Let them choose whatever makes them happy." The afternoon continued at an old-fashioned ice cream parlor downtown. The children's faces lit up as they stared at the glass counter filled with colorful flavors. Ethan insisted they each pick 2 scoops, and he even joined in, getting a double chocolate sundae for himself. "Mr. Ethan, you have ice cream on your nose," Oliver said, pointing with a giggle. Emily laughed, and Ethan, feeling utterly unbothered for once, wiped his nose with a napkin, chuckling along with them. Their final stop was the park, a sprawling green space with swings, slides, and climbing frames. The children dashed toward the playground, leaving Ethan and Emily behind on a park bench. "They're happy," Ethan said after a moment of silence. "They are," Emily agreed, her voice soft. "It's been a while since I've seen them this carefree." Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed slightly. "Emily, I can't change the past. I can't change the decisions I made back then. But I want to." I want to be part of their lives. If you'll let me." Emily studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Ethan, I can see you mean that. But this isn't something that happens overnight. It's going to take time, trust, and patience. If you're willing to put in the effort, then yes. I'd like that." A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "Thank you, Emily. That means more to me than I can put into words." The golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the park as the children came running back toward them, their faces flushed and their eyes sparkling with joy. "Can we come back tomorrow, Mr. Ethan?" Amelia asked, her voice hopeful. Ethan crouched down to her level, his smile soft but genuine. "You can call me Ethan, Amelia. And yes, we can come back as many times as you'd like." As they returned to the mansion that evening, the children dozed off in the back seat of Ethan's car. Emily sat quietly beside him, her head resting lightly against the window. When they arrived, Ethan carried Oliver, who had fallen asleep, into one of the guest rooms. Emily tucked in the others while Ethan stood in the hallway, watching the peaceful scene unfold. "Good night, Ethan," Emily said softly as she emerged from the room. "Good night, Emily," he replied, his voice low but steady. As Ethan retreated to his study, he poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the night sky. For the first time in years, the silence in his mansion felt different. It wasn't hollow or suffocating, it was peaceful. Today had been unlike any other day in Ethan's life. And deep down, he knew it was only the beginning of something much larger, a new chapter filled with hope, connection, and, perhaps, even love. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold as evening descended upon Ethan Caldwell's estate. The day had been filled with light-hearted moments, laughter echoed in corners that had once been silent, and warmth had seeped into spaces long left cold. For Ethan, it felt as though a heavy stone had been lifted from his chest, allowing him to breathe more freely than he had in years. Ethan stood by the window of the library, a glass of water in his hand. Outside, he could see Emily Carter leading her children up the stairs to the guest rooms. Amelia guided her younger siblings, her quiet confidence evident in every step, while Jacob carried a stuffed toy Oliver had nearly forgotten downstairs. Lily trailed behind, clutching Emily's hand tightly. "They're good kids," came Emily's soft voice from behind him. Ethan turned, startled by her quiet approach. Emily stood in the doorway, her expression tired but gentle. Her brown hair was pulled loosely into a ponytail, and her cardigan hung slightly off one shoulder. "They are," Ethan agreed, his voice softer than usual. "You've done an incredible job raising them, Emily. I can see how much they love and trust you." Emily smiled faintly and stepped into the room. "It hasn't always been easy, but they're worth every sacrifice." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Ethan studied Emily's face, taking in the strength and resilience etched into her features. "I've spent so many years building this empire, trying to convince myself that wealth and success would fill the void inside me," Ethan admitted. "But today I felt something different. Watching them laugh, seeing their smiles, it's something I didn't realize I was missing." Emily's gaze softened, but before she could respond, the sharp sound of heels clicking against the marble floors outside shattered the fragile moment. Both Ethan and Emily turned toward the doorway as the sound grew louder. A familiar voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Ethan." Louisa Monroe, Ethan's fiancée and a renowned fashion designer, appeared in the doorway, Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her tailored dress clung to her slender frame with effortless sophistication. Her icy blue eyes swept over Emily before locking onto Ethan. "What is this?" Louisa demanded, her voice low but sharp. Ethan stepped forward, his posture stiffening. "Louisa, this isn't the time." Louisa's gaze flickered back to Emily, her expression growing colder. "Who is she? And why are there children upstairs in our home?" Emily straightened her spine, her voice steady. "I'm Emily Carter, and the children you're referring to are mine." Louisa's brows lifted, and a bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Ethan, care to explain why you've turned our home into a charity shelter?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to Louisa. "That's enough. Louisa, Emily and her children are here because they belong here. This isn't some casual arrangement." The air in the room grew heavy with tension. Emily looked toward the hallway, concern flashing across her face. "I think I should go check on the kids," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken apology. Emily slipped out of the room, leaving Ethan and Louisa alone. "What's going on, Ethan?" Louisa asked, her voice trembling slightly as she folded her arms across her chest. "Who are they to you?" Ethan let out a slow breath, his voice steady. "Emily was a recipient at Glenfield Fertility Clinic. Years ago. I made a donation, a choice I barely thought about at the time. Those children are biologically mine." "Louisa." Louisa's face paled. You're telling me you have children?" "4 children. And you never told me?" "I didn't know." "Louisa," Ethan said firmly, "I found out recently. This wasn't something I kept from you intentionally." Louisa's eyes glistened with a mix of disbelief and anger. "And what now? Are they just going to live here? Are we supposed to play one big happy family?" Ethan's voice dropped. "They're children, Louisa. They deserve love, stability, and a chance to know their father. This isn't about you or me, it's about them." Louisa took a step back, her arms falling to her sides. "You're choosing them over me, aren't you?" Ethan shook his head. "This isn't about choosing sides, Louisa. This is about doing what's right." Before Louisa could respond, the distant sound of a child's voice calling for Emily echoed down the hallway. Ethan turned slightly toward the sound, his expression softening. Louisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll talk about this later, Ethan. But don't think for one second that this conversation is over." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the library, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. Ethan sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the evening pressed down on him, and the fragile sense of peace he had felt earlier was now replaced with a suffocating unease. Somewhere upstairs, the sound of children's laughter still echoed faintly, a fragile reminder of the connection he wasn't ready to lose. The sharp sound of Louisa Monroe's heels faded into the distance, leaving an oppressive silence in Ethan Caldwell's study. He stood frozen, his hand resting on the edge of his desk, his thoughts racing. Outside the door, the distant sound of Emily's voice softly calming one of the children drifted through the hallway, grounding him in the present moment. Ethan exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples as he tried to process the confrontation with Louisa. Every word she had hurled at him still echoed in his mind, sharp and piercing. "You're choosing them over me, aren't you?" Her voice carried the weight of accusation and betrayal. But this wasn't about choices, it was about responsibility. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside cautiously. Her face was pale, her expression guarded. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I didn't mean to overhear. But it was hard not to. Ethan shook his head, gesturing for her to sit. You have nothing to apologize for. Emily. She hesitated before lowering herself onto one of the leather armchairs across from him. Ethan, if this is too much, if our presence here is causing too many problems, we can leave. I don't want to disrupt your life any more than we already have. No, Ethan said firmly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Emily. Please. Don't say that. You and the children aren't a disruption. You're something I didn't realize I needed. Emily's eyes softened, but she remained silent, giving him space to continue. I've spent so many years building walls around myself, pushing people away, convincing myself that success would fill the void inside me. Ethan admitted. But the past few days with you and the kids, it's shown me something different. Something real. Emily's lips pressed into a faint smile, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Ethan. This isn't going to be easy. What happened tonight, it's just the beginning. Louisa, she's not going to let this go quietly. Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. I know. And I'll deal with it. But I refuse to let fear, or anyone else, dictate what's right. Those children deserve to know their father. And you deserve peace. A soft knock interrupted the moment. The door creaked open just enough for Amelia to poke her head inside. Mom? Is everything okay? The young girl asked, her voice laced with concern. Emily turned and smiled faintly. Everything's fine. Sweetheart. Why don't you head back to bed? I'll be there soon. Amelia lingered for a moment, her sharp eyes flicking between her mother and Ethan, before nodding and disappearing back into the hallway. Emily rose from her chair. I should go check on them. Ethan stood as well, walking her to the door. Before she stepped out, she turned to face him one last time. You have a choice to make, Ethan. Not just with Louisa, but with yourself. Decide what kind of man you want to be, not just for us, but for yourself. Her words hung in the air long after she left the room. Later that night, Ethan found himself sitting alone on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the city lights blinking in the distance. His mind was a storm of emotions, guilt, fear, hope, and something else he couldn't quite name. Louisa's words clawed at the edges of his thoughts. You can't have both. Ethan. Make your choice. But deep down, Ethan knew the choice wasn't about Louisa or Emily, it was about facing the truth he had been avoiding for years. He had built his life on a foundation of control and isolation. But the cracks were beginning to show. And in those cracks, light was starting to seep through. The faces of Amelia, Jacob, Oliver, and Lily swam in his mind, their laughter, their smiles, the way they looked at him with trust despite barely knowing him. With a heavy sigh, Ethan stood and crossed the room to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old, faded photo of his mother. Her kind eyes stared back at him, and he could almost hear her voice reminding him of the simple truth she had always tried to teach him. True wealth isn't in what you have, Ethan. It's in the people you love. The weight of that realization settled over him like a blanket, heavy, but warm. Ethan knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would face Louisa. Tomorrow, he would take responsibility, not just for his past choices, but for the future he wanted to build. But tonight, he allowed himself one brief moment of peace. His eyes drifting closed as the distant sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in his memory. The sun was barely rising over Ethan Caldwell's estate when the first whispers of tension began to stir. Golden light stretched across the marble floors and heavy velvet curtains, but it couldn't dispel the unease hanging in the air. Ethan stood in front of the large window in his study. His hands braced against the glass as he stared out at the sprawling gardens below. Downstairs, the scent of breakfast drifted through the air. Emily Carter was busy helping the children with their morning meal. Amelia carefully poured syrup over Jacob's pancakes, while Oliver proudly showed Lily how to stack strawberries into tiny towers. Their laughter, though faint, carried a warmth that managed to reach Ethan even through the thick walls of his study. But beneath the cheerful facade, Emily's mind raced. The confrontation with Louisa the night before had left a lingering sting. She couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile place in Ethan's life was already crumbling. When Ethan finally walked into the dining room, the children greeted him with bright smiles. "Good morning, Mr. Ethan," Oliver said, waving a sticky hand in the air. Ethan managed a faint smile as he ruffled Oliver's hair. "Good morning, everyone." Emily rose from her chair, her expression calm but serious. "Ethan, can we talk? Privately?" He nodded, gesturing for her to follow him to the sunroom. The glass walls let in streams of natural light, but the space felt colder than usual. Emily folded her arms across her chest as she turned to face him. "Ethan, we need to talk about what happens next. About us, about the children." Ethan frowned, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Emily, please, don't make any decisions yet. Not today." Her voice was steady but firm. "Last night showed me something. Ethan, this situation isn't sustainable. Louisa isn't going to let this go. And I refuse to let my children become targets in a war they never asked for." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the sharp sound of heels clicking against marble interrupted him. Both turned toward the entrance of the sunroom just as Louisa Monroe stepped inside. She looked every bit the polished socialite, icy blue eyes, perfectly styled platinum hair, and an outfit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her sharp gaze flickered briefly to Emily before locking onto Ethan. "Well," Louisa said, her voice cool and edged with sarcasm, "isn't this cozy?" "Louisa," Ethan said sharply, stepping slightly in front of Emily. "This isn't the time." "Oh, I think it is," Louisa replied, her arms crossing over her chest. "I've been thinking all night, Ethan, about this situation. About her," she gestured to Emily, "and those children upstairs. How do you see this ending?" "Exactly. You can't have it both ways." Emily shifted slightly, her face pale but composed. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Louisa. I didn't come here to disrupt your life." Louisa's cold smile didn't waver. "Oh, but you have, haven't you? You've waltzed into our home, into our lives, and turned everything upside down." "Enough, Louisa," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You will not speak to her like that." But Louisa wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "You need to make a choice, Ethan. Them or me. Because you can't keep pretending that this fantasy can coexist with reality." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's eyes locked onto Ethan's, searching his face for some kind of answer, for any sign of what he was thinking. But Ethan hesitated. That hesitation was all Emily needed. She inhaled deeply, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "I think we have our answer." Emily turned and walked out of the sunroom, her head held high. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Ethan and Louisa standing alone in the pale morning light. Louisa smirked slightly, her satisfaction evident. "There. That wasn't so hard, was it?" But Ethan didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the doorway where Emily had disappeared. His chest felt tight. His breath shallow. Every instinct in him screamed that he had just let something precious slip away. "I'll be in my room," Louisa said dismissively, turning on her heel and striding out of the sunroom. Ethan remained frozen in place, his mind replaying every moment of the confrontation. Emily's steady voice, Louisa's biting words. In his own silence, the thing that had spoken louder than anything he could have said. Upstairs, Emily began packing their belongings. Amelia and Jacob sat quietly on the edge of the bed, while Oliver and Lily huddled together, sensing the tension in their mother's movements. Ethan stood in the empty sunroom, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the weight of what had just happened. He had reached the breaking point, and he had no idea how to fix it. The silence in Ethan Caldwell's sunroom was deafening after Louisa's departure. The pale morning light cast long shadows across the polished floor, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed distantly from upstairs, a painful reminder of what was slipping away. Ethan sat down heavily in one of the armchairs, his head falling into his hands. His chest felt tight, his mind clouded with regret and frustration. Why didn't I stop her? Why didn't I say something? Time passed unnoticed until a soft knock broke the stillness. The door creaked open, and Margaret Caldwell, Ethan's grandmother, stepped inside. Despite her frail frame, she carried herself with a grace and quiet authority that could silence even the most chaotic of rooms. "Ethan," she said gently, her voice steady. "What have you done, my boy?" Ethan looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I hesitated. "Grandma, I let them walk away." Margaret sighed and shuffled toward the armchair across from him, leaning on her cane as she lowered herself into the seat. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You're scared, Ethan. Scared of change. Scared of vulnerability. Scared of losing control. But love isn't something you can control, it's something you embrace, even when it terrifies you." Ethan's throat tightened, and he looked away toward the window. Outside, the garden stretched endlessly, but they felt empty now. "They're packing, aren't they?" Margaret continued. Ethan nodded silently. "Then what are you doing sitting here? Are you really going to let them leave without a fight?" Her words hit him like a hammer, shattering the fog of indecision clouding his mind. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Margaret's wrinkled hand reached out and clasped his wrist. "Go, Ethan. Don't let fear make this decision for you." Ethan hesitated for only a moment before turning and striding out of the sunroom. Upstairs, Emily zipped up the final suitcase. Her movements were deliberate, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded Lily's favorite sweater and placed it on top of the neatly packed clothes. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale, while Jacob helped Oliver tie his shoes. "Mom," Amelia said softly, "are we really leaving?" Emily knelt down in front of her eldest daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, sweetheart. We can't stay where we're not wanted." "But Mr. Ethan does want us here," Jacob said timidly. Emily closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her face. "Sometimes, Jacob, wanting something isn't enough." Before she could stand, the door to the room burst open, and Ethan stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath. His tie was loose, and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. "Don't go," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Emily stood, her expression a mix of surprise and guarded hope. "Ethan, no, let me say this," he interrupted, stepping into the room, His gaze shifted to each child before landing on Emily. I was wrong. I was scared. But I can't let you walk out of my life. Not like this. The children watched him silently, their wide eyes fixed on his every move. I don't have all the answers, Emily. Ethan continued. I don't know how to be a father, and I don't know how to fix everything overnight. But I know that I can't let you and these children leave without trying. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing, a family. And I'm not going to let fear take that away from me. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. But she didn't move. Didn't speak. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer now. Please, Emily, stay. Give me a chance to prove that I can be the man you and these kids deserve. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Amelia stepped forward, her small voice breaking the stillness. Mom, can we stay? Emily's tears finally spilled over, and she nodded slowly. Okay, Ethan, we'll stay. A visible wave of relief washed over Ethan's face as he exhaled deeply. The children erupted into excited chatter, and Ethan knelt down as Oliver ran into his arms, clutching him tightly. Emily wiped her tears and met Ethan's gaze. This isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, patience, and a lot of effort. Ethan nodded firmly. I know. And I'm ready for that. The tension that had gripped the estate since the previous night seemed to dissolve in that moment. The sun shone brighter through the windows, and the distant sound of birds chirping filled the air. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The early morning light filtered softly through the large windows of Ethan Caldwell's study, casting faint golden patterns across the mahogany desk and shelves lined with leather-bound books. Despite the beauty of the sunrise, the weight on Ethan's chest remained heavy. He stood by the window, staring out over the sprawling estate gardens, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, a man torn between the life he had meticulously built and the life he realized he wanted. Upstairs, Emily Carter sat on the edge of Amelia's bed. The children were still asleep, their faces serene in the warm morning light. Amelia clutched her sketchbook even in her dreams, while Jacob's glasses rested crookedly on the nightstand. Oliver and Lily lay tangled in their blankets, their soft breaths filling the quiet room. Emily let out a slow breath as she brushed a lock of hair away from Lily's face. The confrontation with Louisa, the hesitation she had seen in Ethan, it all weighed heavily on her. Staying had been the right choice. She believed that deep down. But the uncertainty of what came next gnawed at her resolve. A soft knock on the door startled her. Turning, she saw Margaret Caldwell, Ethan's grandmother, standing in the doorway. Despite her frail frame and reliance on a cane, Margaret's sharp eyes were still filled with an undeniable wisdom. May I come in, dear? Margaret asked gently. Emily nodded, standing and offering Margaret the armchair near the window. Of course. Please, sit. Margaret lowered herself carefully into the chair, her movements deliberate but graceful. Her cane rested against her knee as she studied Emily with a knowing gaze. You've been through so much, my dear. Margaret began softly. But here you are, steady, strong, and still fighting for your children. Emily's throat tightened, and she fought back tears. I just want them to have stability, Margaret. They deserve so much more than uncertainty and conflict. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And they will. Emily, you've given them so much already: love, security, and a mother who would move mountains for them. Emily's gaze drifted toward the sleeping children. But is this fair to them? To keep them in this place, caught between two worlds? I don't want them to grow up feeling like they're intruders in someone else's story. Margaret reached out, her wrinkled hand resting gently on Emily's. You're not intruding, Emily. You've brought something into this house that's been missing for years: life, laughter, and love. Ethan sees it too, even if he doesn't know how to express it yet. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she nodded. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression softening as she glanced at the children. Sometimes, dear, the hardest thing isn't loving someone, it's letting them love you back. Downstairs, Ethan stood in the center of his study, staring at his phone. A notification blinked on the screen. Louisa Monroe, we need to talk. Now. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen before he let out a frustrated sigh and tossed the phone onto the desk. He turned toward the window again, his mind clouded with conflicting emotions. Margaret's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Family isn't about contracts or convenience, it's about love. And love requires courage. Ethan. After several long moments, Ethan picked up his jacket and slipped it on. With a determined breath, he strode out of the study, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. In the guest room, Emily gently woke Amelia. The little girl stirred, blinking up at her mother with sleepy eyes. Morning, Mom, she murmured. Good morning, sweetheart, Emily replied softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. Come on, let's get everyone ready. It's a new day. Amelia sat up, her brow furrowed as she looked at her mother. Are we staying, Mom? Emily hesitated for just a moment before nodding. Yes, Amelia, we're staying. For now. The faintest smile appeared on Amelia's lips as she hugged her mother tightly. Meanwhile, Ethan climbed into his car and drove away from the estate, his jaw set and his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His destination was clear. He needed to confront Louisa and close the chapter that had been holding him back for far too long. Back at the estate, Margaret slowly made her way back to her room. She paused briefly at the top of the staircase, glancing down at the sun-drenched foyer below. Her heart carried a cautious hope. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the path ahead was still uncertain. For Ethan, for Emily, and for the children, the next hours would shape everything that came after. In her room, Margaret sat by her window, looking out over the estate grounds where the morning sun had fully risen. The mansion, once a symbol of cold luxury, now felt different, warmer, alive, and full of fragile possibilities. She whispered softly to herself, her voice carried away by the breeze through the open window. Don't waste this chance, Ethan. Don't waste it. The quiet hum of conversation and the clink of glassware filled the upscale restaurant as Ethan Caldwell stepped through the entrance. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp angles of light across the polished tile floors. Seated at a corner table, Louisa Monroe adjusted her sunglasses before placing them carefully on the table beside an untouched cappuccino. She looked up as Ethan approached, her icy blue eyes narrowing slightly. You came, she said, her voice sharp yet controlled. Ethan pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, his expression stoic. You said we needed to talk, so let's talk. Louisa studied him for a long moment, her fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic mug. You know, Ethan, I always thought we wanted the same things: power, success, a life built on certainty. But I see now that I was wrong. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I could fight this, Louisa said, her voice quieter now. I could drag us both through a public scandal. I could make things very uncomfortable for you. But I won't. Because I know when I've lost. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Louisa, this was never about winning or losing. This isn't a contest. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Isn't it? Though? You chose them, Ethan, and I don't blame you for it. But I can't be a part of this. For a brief moment, Ethan saw something vulnerable in Louisa's expression, an unguarded flicker of sadness, regret, and perhaps even acceptance. I'm ending this, Ethan, she said firmly. The engagement, the plans, all of it. I'll have my lawyers sort out the details. You don't need to worry about me causing trouble. Ethan nodded, a pang of regret flickering through his chest. Despite everything, Louisa had been a significant part of his life, and letting go felt heavier than he anticipated. I hope you find happiness, Louisa, Ethan said sincerely. You deserve that. Louisa offered a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, before she picked up her sunglasses and stood. Goodbye, Ethan. He watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, until she disappeared through the restaurant's glass doors. For a moment, he sat there in silence, letting the weight of the conversation settle over him. Back at the Caldwell estate, the afternoon sun painted the garden in warm hues. Emily Carter sat on a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree, watching her children chase each other across the lawn. Oliver was giggling as he darted away from Jacob, while Amelia helped Lily balance on a low stone wall. The sound of approaching footsteps made Emily turn her head. Ethan walked towards her, his expression unreadable but his posture lighter, freer. May I sit? He asked softly. Emily nodded, and he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching the children play. It's over, Ethan said finally. Louisa and I, it's done. Emily turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt or regret. But all she found was sincerity. I'm not going to pretend I have everything figured out, Ethan continued, his voice steady. I've made mistakes, Emily. So many mistakes. But I know this, I want you and the children here. I want to build something real with you. Emily's breath hitched slightly as she processed his words. Ethan, this isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, patience, and trust. I know, Ethan said firmly. And I'm ready for that. Whatever it takes. I'm ready. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Emily nodded. Okay, she said softly. We'll stay. A wave of relief washed over Ethan's face, and a small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Across the lawn, Amelia noticed them sitting together and waved excitedly. Mr. Ethan, come play with us, she called out. Ethan chuckled, rising from the bench and extending a hand toward Emily. Shall we? Emily hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Together, they walked across the sunlit lawn toward the children, where laughter and the promise of a new beginning awaited. As the golden light of the afternoon bathed the Caldwell estate, it felt as though the mansion itself had begun to breathe again. The cold walls seemed warmer, the empty halls filled with faint echoes of joy. And for Ethan, for Emily, and for 4 children who had unknowingly changed everything, the first steps toward healing and love had finally begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the Caldwell estate. The grand mansion, once cold and hollow, now felt alive with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the faint hum of music drifting through the open balcony doors. The gardens were carefully decorated with white flowers, delicate fairy lights hanging from the branches of ancient oak trees, and elegant tables draped in linen. Today was a day of celebration. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored suit as he stood in front of the full-length mirror in his study. The reflection staring back at him was different from the man he had been months ago. His posture was lighter, his expression softer, and his eyes, once cold and distant, were now filled with purpose. A gentle knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Margaret Caldwell entered, leaning lightly on her cane. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she looked at her grandson. "You clean up well, Ethan," she said with a smile. Ethan chuckled softly, turning to face her. "Thank you, Grandma. I wouldn't have made it here without you." Margaret stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "No, Ethan. You made this choice. You opened your heart. And today, you're reaping the reward." Downstairs, the guests were beginning to gather in the garden. Amelia and Jacob helped Oliver adjust his little bow tie, while Lily twirled in her pale yellow dress, her laughter carrying across the lawn. Emily stood nearby, wearing an elegant yet simple ivory dress. Her hair was swept into a loose bun, soft tendrils framing her face. As Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, his eyes immediately found Emily. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The noise of the crowd faded, and all he could see was her. She turned and met his gaze, her smile soft but radiant. The ceremony was intimate, held beneath an arch woven with white roses and greenery. Friends and family gathered close, seated on wooden benches, while the children stood nearby with baskets of petals clutched in their hands. Margaret took her seat in the front row, her cane resting beside her as she dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. When Emily walked down the aisle, escorted by Amelia, the entire garden seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her approach, every step bringing her closer until she finally stood before him. The officiant's words were simple yet profound, speaking of love, trust, and the courage to start anew. When it came time to exchange vows, Ethan's voice was steady, filled with emotion. "Emily, you walked into my life when I didn't even realize how empty it was. You brought light, love, and laughter into a home that had been silent for far too long. I promise to stand by you, to care for you, and to be the best father I can be to Amelia, Jacob, Oliver, and Lily. Today, I'm not just gaining a partner, I'm gaining a family." Emily's eyes shimmered with tears as she spoke her vows in return. "Ethan, you showed me that even the most guarded hearts can learn to love again. You stepped into our lives with kindness and sincerity, and you gave us something I thought we'd never have, a home. I promise to stand beside you, to share in your joys and burdens, and to build a life filled with love and laughter." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the garden erupted into applause. The children tossed flower petals into the air, their laughter ringing like bells. The reception carried on into the evening. The children played tag on the lawn, their formal clothes grass-stained and slightly disheveled. Guests danced under the glow of twinkling lights, and the sounds of clinking glasses and joyful chatter filled the night air. At one point, Ethan found himself sitting on a bench beneath an old oak tree, watching as Emily danced with Amelia while Jacob and Oliver tried to outdo each other with clumsy twirls. Lily, ever the dreamer, sat nearby watching the stars. Margaret joined him on the bench, her smile warm. "You did it, Ethan." Ethan nodded, his voice soft. I didn't do it alone. Margaret patted his hand. That's the thing about family. My dear, you're never really alone. As the night drew to a close, Ethan and Emily stood together on the balcony overlooking the garden. The children had long since fallen asleep, curled up on blankets spread across the grass. Ethan wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. This feels right, he said softly. Emily rested her head against his chest. It does. And it's just the beginning. Above them, the stars glittered against the velvet sky, and the faint sound of distant laughter carried on the breeze. For Ethan Caldwell, the mansion was no longer just a structure of stone and glass. It was a home, a place filled with love, laughter, and the promise of countless new beginnings.
From wealth and isolation to love and family, Ethan Caldwell's journey was anything but predictable. Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.